So I think those are some of the reasons I think this podcast is important and it can differentiate itself from other leadership podcasts. What about you, Jodah?
What? Oh, you finished? I've noticed in my career a leadership or organizational breakdown or inefficiency. There we go. I don't want to say breakdown because I don't even know if it was like this before or what it was like necessarily before or what's going on after or whatever, but an inefficiency that causes grief around getting shit done, basically.
But skip white noise because it's a load of stinking, toxic turds, and everyone involved with it should be eviscerated by a plume of toxic gas. All right, Jodah, so what did you think of that movie, White Noise, on Netflix? I think it was pseudo-absurdism. It was a train wreck, god-awful waste of time.
Hold on a sec. I got to get some Skittles. Before I can't answer this without getting some Skittles. Hold on.
Oh, yeah.
I'm getting Skittles.
Are you going to bring me some? I'd like some Skittles.
All right, I got my Skittles.
Oh, my God. You literally got up from the podcast to get some Skittles.
Yeah, I did. Yeah, we're talking about white noise. Why are we wasting our breath? I think it was. I think I liked it to some degree. I like the execution. I like the parts, like the individual pieces. I enjoyed. I normally don't like Adam Driver that much, but for some reason I liked him in this. I thought the casting.
I liked Adam Driver. I don't really have, for the most part, criticisms about the actors necessarily. It's mostly the script and the director. I think they both just did a terrible job. It was trying too hard, much too hard. And I think we talked about this earlier. I'm a big fan of movies about death, right? My son, for Christmas, did an art depiction of a scene from The Seventh Seal, Ingmar Bergman's movie, where the knight is playing death, a game of chess, on the rocky shores. And that's a movie that's about death, but it's about death without hitting the nail too hard on the head. Yes, the knight character is afraid of death. That's why he's playing chess, to prolong his to prolong the inevitable demise, because he's been contaminated by the plague. And it's Max von Sydow. It's the name I keep searching for. Max von Sydow plays the character of the knight. And so, the whole movie is about death without, again, it does such a better job. And there's even a character named Death in the movie. But White Noise hits it so clearly on the head that they're like, the Adam Driver character is like, I'm the one who's supposed to be afraid of death, because everyone's afraid of death in this movie. But Adam Driver literally says, I own being afraid of death. And it's like, well, no, you don't, Adam Driver's character. You don't. And I don't know. I could just go on about just how shitty this movie.
I could totally tell. I mean, I think I'm not going to defend it. Like I said, I felt like it was a waste of my time. But I think going into the specifics and trying to compare it to other movies about death would be also a waste of time.
I'm making a point that I think that there's a way to talk about death in film and there's a way not to. And Seventh Seal, go see that. It is always on Criterion Channel, so check it out. But skip White Noise because it's a load of stinking, toxic turds, and everyone involved with it should be eviscerated by a plume of toxic gas.
Yeah, well, and he just kind of gave away part of the movie. Yeah, totally.
There's spoilers.
There's spoilers.
Don't watch it. Just listen to the spoilers. Anyways,
I've been told
it fascinates me, though.
It does sound like the book was good, though, and it was written in the 80s, which makes me also wonder how it was translated, how strong the translation was, and something was lost in the translation, and in fact, if it was really important that it was written in the 80s, right? Because there was a lot of interesting.
I'm sure the book is always better than the film, and I'm sure in this case they butchered the novel. I'm sure.
I don't know. I haven't read the book, but yeah, it wasn't a film for me. That's for sure. So, yep.
And that's not to say that people aren't interested in death, because people are obsessed with it. And I find it fascinating. One of our most popular episodes that we did this year, Jodah, was on death.
Yes, Dan, it was.
Death in the organization.
Yes. So, all right. So, folks, welcome to the Sense and Signal podcast. This is a very special edition where both Dan and I are going to cry for a couple of minutes.
Or just complain about Netflix movies.
But, we've been doing this podcast for 6 months now. And we had a vision and a particular form of execution, and obviously
for those vision, I think we discovered the vision through trial and error.
I think we have a vision, but obviously through our efforts, that it's changed and modified over time. And, obviously we're doing this on a shoestring budget and with shoestring time and the whole thing's a shoestring, one giant shoestring.
The shoestrings are frayed. Look how you have to force them through the shoe holes, right? The holes. Lick them and get the lighter out and burn the end.
You're licking the ends. Yeah. You're trying to get them into the leather.
That's the level of podcast we're doing, ladies and gentlemen.
But I hope those who have watched us thus far can see the earnestness that we're approaching this. And some of you might be wondering, where are we going with this? We've had several different types of people on this show. We haven't expressed on a repeated level what we're talking about. And so we're going to take this. I think we're going to take this moment. Hopefully we don't beat this moment to death, but we're going to take this moment and kind of talk about where we're coming from, why we're doing what we're doing, and where we're going to go with it. Right?
Yeah, no, that's exactly what we're going to do. And so, yeah, I guess maybe that's a good transition to talking about why the hell are we doing this podcast, Jodah?
Yep.
I'll say this, some context. I kind of got a little bit of a head start with Jodah. I was like, I'm going to start this podcast called The Signal. And I was doing some recording. And then, I met Jodah for the first time about 6 months ago.
We were hanging in front of a 7-Eleven. No.
Yeah. And then I was saying, Jodah, I'm doing a podcast. He was like, oh man, I've always wanted to do one. Let me buy a Coke and I'll come join you. And so we got our computers and started recording. That's not entirely the truth.
Not too far from it, though.
But actually, we've known each other quite a bit longer, which we'll get to in a moment. But yeah, so I guess when I started the initial podcast, it was really just to explore leadership and sense making and to deepen my understanding about those topics. Because I had recently, in the last couple of years, finished my doctorate in higher education leadership, and I had published a couple papers on leadership in addition to my dissertation. And, and one of the reasons that I pursued that degree was I've seen failures in leadership, not only at my organization, but and others, and citywide and statewide and nationally and internationally, even in the cosmos, terrible leadership in the solar system. So I figured
cosmic leadership is failing. Yep.
Cosmic failures. And so I figured, maybe I could learn something to help improve leadership and sense making.
And I wonder if there's a zeitgeist out there. I can't imagine that you and I were kind of came into this together at different tangents, right? But yet we had the same impetuses to do this. Your reasoning, or it's like I don't even really saying my reason. Just point to his reason. It was pretty much the same thing. And I don't want to necessarily say failures in leadership, but I've noticed in my career a leadership or organizational breakdown or inefficiency. There we go. I don't want to say breakdown because I don't even know if it was like this before or what it was like necessarily before or what's going on after or whatever, but an inefficiency that causes grief around getting shit done, basically. There's a lot of quagmire behavior that seems unnecessary. but yet because of all this cruft and something, and it's always, it's, like, I think like what are those famous books, like, was it Catch 52, is it, or no, 52
Catch 22,
Catch 22, and the movie Brazil, and all these movies that show bureaucracy just get in the way of people being at their best. And who's at fault for that? What's causing? Is it a who? Is it a manifestation of something, of a bunch of who's? And to Dan's point, I don't say he didn't say he doesn't have the answers, but I don't have the answers, and I too wanted to start
all the answers,
which is why I reached out to him. I said, Dan, I need the answers for these problems. He goes, oh, sure. But to make a long story short, I too was thinking, you know what? One of the best ways to teach or to learn is to teach. And so this is kind of that process where I think I want to learn more. And while I'm learning more, and I'm hoping that I can take you along on that ride of learning more about the dynamics of the ever-changing world that we live in, that are these organizations that are driven by various forces, which whether leaders and management and SEC filings and all these things, and how much control do we have, and how much control don't we have, and how much control should we have?
Yeah, I feel you on all those points, and it almost I agree. I want this. I think I don't have all the answers. I was joking there in case you didn't get my.
He's got a lot of them. You should give him a call. Actually, I'll give you his phone number when we're done.
Oh yeah, well, or tweet at me. Yeah. Right. We'll talk a little bit about Twitter later. I got some thoughts on Twitter, but I think it's kind of a universal, and I guess with the rise of the bureaucracy, it's definitely been parodied in novels and in films like you mentioned, Brazil and MASH and Catch 22 and others. The inefficiencies of the bureaucracy and how it drives everybody crazy. And you have concepts like people failing up, which we have all seen, where how did that person get into that position? And why? And it's unfathomable to me from the outside. So, there is a lot of dysfunction in organizations. We can't deny that.
Is there such thing as a promoting down? I wonder, is there an opposite of failing up?
There's demotion, right? Or
can there be a concept of you're doing well, so you're losing out, you're going back? Anyways, sorry.
I think there is a concept that you're doing so well in the position that you're at that they don't want to move you out of that position.
That's interesting. So
I think that could possibly happen. Yeah. It's like, oh man, if we move this person out of that position, they're rocking it and we don't want to lose them rocking it, and that's from a leadership perspective. That's a risk you got to take, is to give that. And I mean, I think as we go through, one of the things, we'll talk about themes that we've touched on in our process of going through these, developing these podcasts and engaging with people in interviews. But so I think we'll come back to this point about developing and mentoring employees and the importance of that, and taking the risk to give people opportunities to grow, because that's part of your job as a leader. But I don't know if we necessarily need to go there right at this moment.
No, and real quick, for those of you who we're kind of assuming some. I don't know what we're assuming at this moment, but I'm going to do a quick introduction to me. I'm Jodah Jensen, and I've been working in the software industry primarily for over 20 years in all forms of product development capacity. A little bit on the programming side. Wasn't necessarily my strength, albeit I thought it was super fun, but primarily on the strategy and sort of product discovery side, and particularly in more of a design and creation perspective, less so probably from a biz dev side of things. And I met Dan about 25 years ago when we were going to school in San Francisco. So that's who I am. We're going to talk more about that.
Jodah and I used to be smokers back then.
Yes.
And we would hang out in front of the dorms and eventually the student apartments at San Francisco State University.
Yes.
And we were fixtures. We were fixtures in front of the dorms, just
Puffing away.
Puffing away, talking about all kinds of things. So this podcast is really an extension of that relationship.
It is.
You could not, as our friend Sam liked to say, you could not avoid us going into the student apartments in San Francisco State in 1996. We would be there talking about Charles Bukowski.
We haunted the front of the building.
Quentin Tarantino or something. There was a Bosnian guy, crazy Bosnian up there screaming at us and lots of other folks, characters that maybe we'll talk about eventually in our podcast journeys. But yeah, this, so we've had a long relationship that we've developed over years. And so I would say this is an extension of that relationship, the conversations that we've engaged in over the years. But I think we're at a point where we're in, not late stage careers, but mid to late stage careers. I'm like Jodah. I've been in the area I've been working in for about 20-something years, 22 years, which is higher education. And I've been a faculty member and mostly an administrator during those times in multiple different roles, with increasing responsibility over that time. And I've done consulting work and leadership training. And like I said, I got my doctorate in leadership. And I also have an arts background too, and have a deep history with theater and performing arts. And maybe those are things we'll touch on eventually during the evolution of this show. But I also bring that perspective to these conversations.
I'll say Dan at some point in time in his life discovered the ability to warp time as we know it. There were moments in his career, this is after college, where he was married, had a kid, had a full-time job, and at the same time was running theater shows and had another teaching classes. And I mean, I don't know where this guy got his one energy and two, where he molded time space so they could get this was Dr. Dan Tarker was one of the most efficient outputters I'd met or I'd known for quite a while. Just amazing.
Yeah, no, I think it comes down to systems and getting systems
PhD,
in place.
And then working on a PhD.
And then working on a doctorate too. Yeah, no, kind of crazy. My family would probably say that I neglected them a little bit here and there.
You said Alex doesn't even know your name, right? I mean, so.
Oh, yeah, my son doesn't even know my name.
Or if you're his dad at all. He's like, who is this guy?
He made me a nice piece of art for Christmas, and that was inspired by what he knew was one of my favorite movies. So, which was The Seventh Seal again. Anyways, yeah, no, I mean, Jodah and I think, and Jodah, I've always been impressed with how resilient Jodah has been over the years in a very topsy-turvy industry, which is the .com tech software industry, where where I live in higher education, which can be very static, lower paying, but probably a little bit more secure. He's had to navigate the ups and downs of .com booms and busts, and the trials and travails of that, and the opportunity to work with a lot of different companies, which I don't have that perspective. And I think it's a really valuable perspective that Jodah brings, that he has worked with a lot of startups as well as very established companies like Oracle. So he can bring a broad breadth of knowledge about the .com and tech sector to these conversations.
Yeah, and that's interesting you bring that up. I think you actually touched on, and gotta hope we're not boring you. We're just trying to get you guys to know who we are a little bit, and then we'll wrap things up. But what you said is probably one of the main reasons why I'm interested in doing Sense and Signal, or it's not the main reason, but the main driver that provided the information was that working in various different types of companies, as many as I have. I've seen so many flavors of different kinds of behaviors and approaches to leadership because I've worked in not just different leaders, but different leaders in different domains and environments, that I start to, through a triangulation almost, I started to see trendings of things that promoted success and trending that promoted failure. And I'm going to be honest, I think I saw more trendings of failure than success, and that might not be untrue for most people. Things probably more often fail than succeed. I don't know if that's true or not. I would think so. If you're really, what do they say? If you're not failing a lot, you're not really trying.
Right.
So and I was like, why are we repeating these every time I go to a new company? That's like, it's as if I've started all over again. And I'm looking at the conversations like, these problems have been solved, or at least I think they have, or at least I feel there are recipes out there that people should be talking about, and they tend to not be for some reason. And I felt like in these companies, things always seem to be ignored, almost willfully ignored, around the conversations that you should have to improve communication, to improve interrelationships, to improve leadership, to improve followship. The meta conversation just seems to be just passed by, and maybe it never was. I can't. It's hard for me to see people having the meta conversation back in 1950. Maybe they did, maybe they didn't. And we can talk. We actually have a little thing. We'll probably talk more about the differentiation between leadership then and now. But it was that, and I was like, God, can we improve the way companies are run? And maybe is that the process of doing that is actually rethinking about how companies are to be run. And I think we're discovering that as we've kind of started to do some of this uncovering over the past 6 months.
Yeah, and I think, and I would say organizations, not just companies, but organizations, whether they're nonprofits, educational institutions like the ones I work within, and even, other type of organizational entities out there, clubs, whatever. Once you get 2 or 3 people together, you basically have an organization. And so we're really thinking about this podcast as really exploring those organizational dynamics from the micro to the macro level, and looking at how we can approach leadership to make those organizations effective and successful, and making sure that people and the organizations, the people that are within those organizations, are thriving.
No, that's right. That's right.
And I think many of the discussions that we've had have lended themselves to that theme for sure. And, I'll say, the last 6 months has been, we've learned a lot. We're still learning. I remember when we first started, we had to deal with all the tech stuff. And I'm actually sharing this for anyone who's interested in starting a podcast. I'm on Facebook all the time. Not as much as I used to be. Because
you're showing our age. We got to move on over to Instagram, or maybe even go to
join TikTok. I'm on Instagram. I'm on Instagram, TikTok, LinkedIn. I'm on all of them.
Yeah, not me.
For Trust or whatever it is, Truth Social. I'm not on Truth Social. Can't find me there. Maybe an imposter. But anyways, I'm part of some Facebook groups around podcasting. It seems like everybody and their sisters starting a podcast these days. So I share,
my niece who's 7 years old will be starting a podcast probably this year.
Well, everyone wants to be an influencer, right?
That's right.
Yeah. So, and that's great. I think there's a place for, people to find new ways to disrupt traditional media and get their voices out, because there's a low bar for entry, which makes which is a good thing and a bad thing, right? Because it makes it hard to get whatever you want to get out, above the noise, right? Because there's a lot of stuff out there that you're competing with these days, not just traditional media, but everybody else who's starting podcasts or keeping their podcasts going. And so it's been challenging, not just getting the word out, but learning the technical side. Yeah. How do we set up our cameras? What platform do we use? How do we edit these things? How do we make them dynamic? How do we post to get to get subscribers? All that stuff. It's been a real learning YouTube algorithm and dynamics, and then the dynamics of all the other audio platforms like Spotify and Apple. It's been a real learning curve. It's not for the faint of heart.
Yeah. Anybody out there who wants to help us with this and thinks they could be a producer, maybe reach out to us. We could leverage it. I don't know what we're going to do with monetization of that, but anybody who's interested, because a lot of our effort goes into sort of the production and but it's been fun. It's a lot of work, and we could probably do better work, more smarter work. I'm assuming that's kind of where we're at right now, where we're figuring out how we can streamline our efforts. Where can we put our money and our effort and get the biggest bang to get this content out to you, to find people to speak to improve our approach to this whole thing.
Because we have taken from the tech perspective, right? We've tried to take an agile approach, learning as we go, putting out episodes, kind of assessing them. Not just kind of assessing them and then making incremental improvements with each episode that we launch. And we've gotten lots of feedback from Jodah's dad, which we've appreciated it. Doug, we love you. We're going to get to your comments later in the episode, Doug. That's a teaser.
The critique
That's a teaser for everybody. At the very end will be Doug's critiques, Jodah's dad's critiques of the Sense and Signal podcast. But so look forward to that, ladies and gentlemen. Look to it. It's coming. It's going to be a blast.
It'll be a segment. So, hey, Dan, so I'm going to ask you a question. Why does the world need another podcast about sense and signals, or about sense making? And we haven't really discussed the notion of sense making and sort of the tools, which we'll get to in a second. But why does the world need sense and signal?
I think there's several value propositions within this podcast, right? And I'm even learning to think like that from some of the conversations we've had with some of the people that we've had on this podcast, to think about what is the value of any product that you develop. Because from education, even though higher education is a product, we don't necessarily think in terms of that like that as you do in the tech sector. And I think one of the benefits of this particular podcast is our unique perspectives that we bring and kind of synthesize together. You bringing in the tech sector and the knowledge around Agile and Scrum and, the different frameworks that the tech sector uses in product development. And I bring the higher ed perspective. How do we do things in higher education, and, the research methods that we use to make decisions and so forth. So, and the cultural differences that differentiate those two sectors. So I think that's one value, a benefit, is that we bring those two perspectives together. I think, I've watched, so we have a guest that we're going to probably talk about a little bit later, but I'm not going to mention her name here. But I saw her on another podcast, and she complained to us when we first had her on our show, before we had her on, that she had done some podcasts she wasn't very happy with, and she said, I buried those podcasts. I wouldn't promote them. Because they were kind of boring and dry and just superficial. And I actually watched what I think was one of those podcasts the other day, and I got 5 or 6 seconds into it, and I was like, oh my God, this is just so dry and boring. And I think so the other value that we're going to try and bring to this podcast is an entertainment aspect, that we want this to be light. We want it to be irreverent. We want to joke around and build a relationship with our audience, and kid around with each other and our guests, and bring some levity to what is often a very dry and serious concept. And also, I think I don't want this podcast to become who's that TED Talk lady, Brie? I don't know. Oh, who I'm talking about.
Yeah, the dare to lead.
The dare to lead. I think that's all the positive cheerleading, empathy, emotional support stuff is great. And we're going to talk about some of that stuff too. But I don't want us to be a traditional leadership and sense-making podcast. I want us to be able to go outside the box and talk about different things that leaders should be talking about if they're wise, right? Like, the Chat CPG platform that's out. I think we're going to have an episode later on this year, earlier this year, about that disruptive technology. And so thinking outside the box, blockchain and crypto, what does that mean to our leadership approaches as well? Because those could be disruptive technologies. So keeping an eye on the ball for what's disrupting the complex systems that we live in, and having discussions about that. And finally, really focusing on that sense-making process. I believe all leadership is rooted in sense-making, because in order to make an effective decision or an informed decision, you have to take time to make sense of the world. And that's actually a very scientific thing to explore, because it's rooted in your own consciousness. You have to perceive the world, make sense of it, and you do it through your senses, your cognitive schemas, your information gathering strategies, the people you associate with and talk with to gather data. And we, like, one of our catchphrases now is always be gathering data, right? Or always be collecting data, ABCD. And so, being cognizant of that important sense-making approach, because we do live in complex environments that are constantly shimmering and changing, and we have to be nimble and adaptive to respond. So I think those are some of the reasons I think this podcast is important, and it can differentiate itself from other leadership podcasts. What about you, Jodah?
What? Oh, you finished?
That was long-winded. I get long-winded sometimes.
I'm sorry. What is it? Is it Monday? Yeah.
But I hope it was deeply impassioned.
It was utterly impassioned. It sent me off to some crazy-ass dreams there. And I want to say something. I want to say that the Sense and Signal name. So Dan and I worked hard on coming up with that Sense and Signal name, and like he said, he started his podcast just called The Signal, and I don't know what. I think we probably were going to change it just because I was coming on board, so we weren't just going to keep the old name, because it wasn't necessarily that was a bad name unto itself, but we were and we went through all sorts of things, and we were thinking, what's with senses and signals and senses and signals, and we were trying to think of all these witty kind of connotations, and finally somehow just after attrition we were like, why not just sense and signal? And so for those of you who think that it's an actual overt play off of Sense and Sensibility, believe it or not, it was not. We didn't even think about that until after, like, someone said, oh, it's like Sense and Sensibility, and we're like, oh yeah, it is like Sense and Sensibility. It was literally independent of that. We knew that we wanted to do with the signals, so if there's not, I think, okay, so let me dial it back here. So I think I probably have a shorter response to that question of why another course. And goes to sleep. Jesus. And he actually falls asleep on me regularly. All the time. I think the reason why a podcast like ours is necessary, because there's a bunch of great podcasts and great leadership talkers out there that do some pretty amazing things. But I think one of the things that one of the approaches that we're going to be taking that isn't really being addressed out there is that, as we mentioned, I don't have the answers, and even if I had a answer, I am so postmodern. I would say that it's a answer, and there are many other possible answers as well. You pick your framework, and so it's contextual, and Dan and I bring that to this conversation of the contextualness of things. And we really want to help people break down the distinctions of things and not necessarily tell you what the answer to your problems. Because sometimes if you have the parts laid out to you and sort of an understanding of the relationships in those systems, you'll gain a perspective that's meaningful for you. And I don't think a lot of other podcasts are doing that, right? Because again, it's clickbait. If Dan and I said, follow these 3 steps and you'll make it to CEO in 4 days, we'll get tons of clicks. And we're not saying we're not going to do that. We probably
like Elon Musk sucks. Destroy Elon Musk. But and we get tons of clicks.
But Dan and our spirits aren't in there, right? We're more. I mean, I'm speaking for both of us, and I think I'm kind of speaking. We're more shovels than hammers on some level. We like to uncover and reveal. We want illumination, paradigm shifts, things like that. And again, I'm not saying there aren't people out there aren't talking about this, but our fundamental goal is to help illuminate the problem space, not define the problem space for you.
Yeah, and I think, to get back to postmodernism, we're both very comfortable with living in an ambiguous space where, no, we don't have all the answers, but we do want you to have takeaways at the same time.
That's right.
And so I know that's something Jodah really wants to emphasize in this podcast is that I'm fine, I'm an academic. I'm fine with just letting it, get very woo-woo. But Jodah wants some practical takeaways because he's a product guy.
Dan's got the French movie ending, and I've got the I don't know. What's the definitive ending? Star Wars ending.
The Star Wars, the final battle ending.
You know who won.
It's just click, we're done.
Dan's movie ends with Kenobi and Vader swinging their swords at each other, and it ends right there. You don't even know
exactly. What the hell was the point of that movie?
Yeah. So that's kind of why I think. And I think I was not long-winded, but maybe a little more woo-y in what I just said, probably.
No. I think you're right on spot, on target with that, for sure. And I think, one thing, we started off doing episodes with just the 2 of us to kind of get our sea legs and having conversations, and then started layering in guests.
Yeah.
And that was the other discovery that I think was really important, because I know we had some tension, Jodah, between we wanted to focus just on our conversations versus guests, and we had a little bit of tug of war there. And then once we started bringing in the guests, I think we both found that they brought a nice layer and a different perspective to our conversations. And one thing I really appreciate that I think we're going to be continuing to strive for is, with us all being, because of one of the benefits of COVID-19, and there are benefits from what happened with COVID. Yes, it was a tragic 3 years that we've been through, and lots of people died, and horrible. And we're not even going to get into the culture war stuff, but there are some tangible benefits, like our increased use of technology for good, right? And one of those is that we can now interview people, because we're all accustomed to using this technology. We can interview people all around the globe. And so I'm thinking one of our first international guests was Zoe Fragou, who is in Athens, Greece. She's an Athens, Greece-based psychologist working on her PhD in psychology and organizational leadership. And having her on really kind of opened my eyes to, we can bring really interesting thinkers from all around the world together to build a community of folks to engage in these discussions. And I think that's one thing I've enjoyed about having the guests on.
Yeah. And we're still, we're still feeling our putting, or what did you say, our sea legs, but the guests are great, and they're great for, I'll say, for very, very practical reasons. They're easier shows for us to do because we don't have to plan quite as much, because we can lean on the guests to sort of help kind of drive the show. So it kind of usually helps me and Dan throughout the week, so we don't have to put as much sort of effort in actually driving the entire topic. There is that part, but having, like he said, having them on opens up the dialogue, and it's a great way to kind of get at topics in a way that we probably never would have considered it. And it opens up future topics for us down the line.
Because I think one thing we're going to try and do as we go into next year is look at some of the episodes that we've already done and think about what are some points that we can extend. One thing we've been doing, because we've been publishing a lot more shorts, which if you're a podcaster, I'd recommend doing the shorts thing because it actually works to get more views and clicks and stuff like that and more attention. Because we are in an attention economy. But we have been using that Google Analytics and the data, the YouTube data to look at what are people interested in, what are they viewing again and again, to pick out future topics. So I think that's something that we're going to do too. And I mean, I have discovered some themes, Jodah, that I think have been surprising and informative. Like one is the theme of the importance of storytelling that has come up again and again. And here, in a sense, that's what we're doing right now. We're constructing a story about our experience together with this podcast.
That's right.
To make sense of it.
And what about empathy? There was empathy is also one that's we've been running with and having people feel that in the world around you and the people that you work with.
Yeah, no, empathy has been a huge one, and I want to get to that in a second. But I think, we're going to have, as we go forward, we're going to have some of those people who spoke to us about storytelling, like Zoe Fragu and Hannah Gala and Hassan Sorrells, all spoke to in different ways. They all spoke to the aspect of storytelling and how important it was. For Hassan, it was looking to great literature. And Zoe too, for Zoe and Hassan, they both spoke about, they both echoed, like, you don't read management books. I mean, Hassan went even further and said, the MBA.
Yeah. Wait, did he say language. That? Are you sure?
He basically did.
He said, Hassan, we're not saying you said that, but I think we're paraphrasing.
It's a paraphrase. Anyways, he said, forget the NBA and, read a book of literature, read Shakespeare or Jane Austen. And Zoe, recommended Milan Kundera, which I know Jodah's been reading The Unbearable Lightness of Being because of that conversation.
That's right.
Although I still say Immortality is the better book from Kundera. But they're both great. And it emphasizes that there's a lot to learn from literature about leadership. And I think that's a theme I definitely want to continue to explore. And then Hannah really got into the evolutionary aspects of storytelling and how, we are terrible sense makers. That's one of the challenges of being a human being. We're not very good at making sense of the world. And so if we're constructing stories based on flawed data that we're gathering about our existence, then our stories are going to be flawed too. And so there are benefits to storytelling, and there's also dangers to storytelling.
Well, and then we even one of the episodes we did by ourselves was actually this notion of a postindustrial workforce or environment, which I definitely want to drive more from. What was the gentleman's name? Wicket
Veek.
or Veek?
Veek.
Yeah. And I mean, his whole premise is like, hey, everybody, I hope you're sitting down for this. But his whole premise is that leaders aren't there to set the direction or tell you what to do. Well, no, let me rephrase that. They are there to set the direction, but they're not there to tell you what to do. Their primary role is to set the narrative by which then the expertise, which has been hired below, or probably a better term than below, but has been hired to execute, they take that narrative and they're all working towards that same narrative. But the leader himself is not the person who's actually saying how to execute and where to go with that execution. It's a team effort. And whether you agree with that or not, it puts a lot of emphasis on storytelling for the leadership out there currently in today's world.
Yeah, and that's a sense-making process, right? And because he calls it that the post-industrial organization is a sense-making organization. You're gathering data and you're constructing narratives based on the data that you're gathering about your environment and your situation in order to move forward. And so leaders need to create an environment where that data can be collected and that we can co-construct the narratives that help move us forward. That was a fascinating episode. I definitely think we should keep pursuing that strand of thought as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then there is the empathy part, as another theme, which I thought, Brad Topliff spoke to that pretty deeply. And
I think Hannah brought up empathy as well. I think there was a
yes,
conversation, and then Dan
Torres
talked about it as well within his conversation with us. Yep, that's right.
Yeah, no, they came up again and again. And, empathy is an interesting thing. And I was watching another podcast recently, which I'm not going to name because it's a different type of podcast. But they had a guest on who challenged the idea of empathy and said that you should really be focusing on sympathy. And so that's an interesting debate that might be interesting to have
I find that
later
very
on in the
interesting.
podcast.
That's very interesting. Yeah, we want to talk about it now, but it's funny because of our conversations. I've always, me doing what I've done, I've always been about empathy and sympathy, but empathy in the sense that you can feel for the person that you're making something for or helping with. But because of our conversations, I had never heard of the terminology. What'd you call it? Negative empathy or dark empathy?
Empathy, yeah.
Dark empathy. And I was like, what the heck would be dark empathy? But then it makes complete sense. Just because you can.
Well, that was a real discovery, though, and that speaks to the sympathy thing, right? Like
that's what I was saying. That's what I'm talking about. It made me realize that empathy into itself is like a bad analogy, but like a gun, it can be used for good or a bad, I guess, and it was like, so then I started thinking maybe sympathy is actually the thing that you want to actually be thinking about. I haven't listened to what you talked about, but when you said that, I find that very fascinating. Again,
I think that person's argument was that empathy could be, you could delude yourself with empathy, because how can you really walk in somebody else's shoes? Because that's really what empathy means. Like, I'm walking in somebody else's shoes, I'm experiencing what they're experiencing, and that could delude you could have some delusions produced by that type of thinking, like right. Really being convinced that you are empathetic, when in fact what you might really be just doing is just being sympathetic, which is imagining what somebody else is experiencing.
Yeah, for sure. Or even if your empathy could be misdirected, you might think you have empathy, but your emotions are actually not empathetic, just some other emotion that isn't really tied to what's happening to them. So very, very fascinating stuff for sure.
Yeah, and so there were other themes that came up too, and I definitely think that that's one that I want to explore too. More deeply. We are going to get back to the Bitcoin and blockchain conversation with Mr. Key that he had. He's going to bring on one of his partners to talk with us. I'm still skeptical about blockchain and Bitcoin. That episode was called, initially was called, Explain Bitcoin and Blockchain to Dan's grandmother. Because I do find it still a mysterious thing. And now with the FPX or FTX, whatever, that Sam Bankman-Fried fiasco, I'm even more skeptical about blockchain and Bitcoin.
We definitely want to speak to more people out there around this notion of technology. We have a good friend between me and Dan who's full on in this whole Bitcoin thing, and that episode we did with Mr. Key was one of his favorites, and he felt that we didn't get it, and he's probably right, that we were walking away from that probably not completely as on board with what we had heard as we probably should have been. It's the disruptive nature that they're expressing is probably extraordinarily profound. And when we think about it, how it can change in the working world as we know it, it's not just about, when you talk to these people about this coin, it's and it's about functionally changing the mechanisms of transaction, of causation, and then how does that affect the world as we know it? And so as we move forward, in this world, we're going to be there'll be this deluge of new technology that's going to change the way we engage with our work, change the way work engages with us, and will our organizations, will our leadership, will our government be able to move fast enough to accommodate these changes? I would be arguing that they haven't been up to this point, which is a little scary to me. But can we help? And can we help be part of that conversation? So we will definitely be looking to speak to more people with around these new technologies, whether it's artificial intelligence, whether it's blockchain, whether it's info security. What does all this mean to the world that is increasingly becoming interconnected through the technologies, and not just connected, guided, if not just guided, led by the technologies?
Well, the world's going to be disrupted by a lot of these technologies, or is in the process of being disrupted, which is something that Mr. Key was trying to get at with us. What's the future of middle management?
That's right.
Was a question that we tackled, and I think he said there won't be any.
That's right.
Because I think there's one thing I want to explore when we have Mr. Key and some other guests back to talk about the blockchain and by extension crypto conversation is kind of this libertarian streak that's within that community. Because I definitely think there is a political, ideological, psychological mindset that the blockchain and cryptocurrency appeals to, which is more of a libertarian mindset. So I could see where not everyone's going to buy into crypto. Some people want a strong state to give them security and help, and that's kind of a more liberal position, right? Whereas the people who don't want any state control of their assets and their assets, basically, they're going to be more inclined to pursue something like crypto and blockchain and decentralized commerce and finance.
You know what? I never thought about that connection. I both agree and disagree. Where in the sense I agree, but I think it's a bit reductive. But that is interesting because there is that aspect to it, and I'm wondering, would you have to lean libertarian to bite onto these technologies? I think
if he's
no. I'm just saying. I'm like I said. I'm not saying that it doesn't feed into it. But I don't. Maybe now's not the time to talk. But that's interesting. I never thought about.
I think it's a thing to explore. More deeply at some point.
Yeah, for sure.
Speaking of disruptive technologies, I was thinking about our interview with Christine Ng, who we talked about data analytics and marketing with her, and one of her focuses of that conversation was the importance of using data to make decisions. And she comes from the realm of marketing, so she was using data through that lens. And she talked deeply about Google Analytics. Well, we now see Google suddenly challenged with the chat's CPG bot, right? That new chat bot that's out, which, we experimented, Jodah, you and I did some experimentation with it over the weekend, and it's pretty damn impressive. And if it can outdo Google in a search, that's going to be very disruptive to the type of data that can be collected, right, on people. Because that OpenAI, from my understanding at this point, is probably not collecting a lot of data. I'm sure it's collecting data. Let's be clear. You're putting in questions, its answer. It's collecting data, but it's not collecting data and delivering it to other people in the way that Google Analytics does, which Google delivers data so that people can look at it like us, who are doing a podcast, and kind of refine your marketing strategy to enhance the delivery of the product that you're trying to get out into the world.
Yep.
And so I could see it totally disrupting marketing and the whole data analytics area in the marketing field.
Yeah, that's going to be probably one of our topics a lot this year, I'm assuming, if not directly, indirectly. It's definitely opened everybody's eyes. Everybody's talking about it.
I want to hit the final theme was just overall mental frameworks to think about our reality. We talked about with Tina Greenbaum. and Young Suk Ko about mental frameworks. Young was one of was actually our first guest. Brave Young. Thank you for being our first guest and going through that trial by whatever.
And she was great. She brought some class and
she did.
calm demeanor to the whole frenetic aspect that we were in those early days. So yeah, it was awesome.
And she spoke to empathy too, right? And care. And she has a metaphor about using gems, like thinking about your life like a diamond, and you have to care for that diamond, even in the workplace. And so she brought that, and that's a mental mindset, I think. And then also Tina Greenbaum with mental mastery mindset, which kind of gets to that whole stoicism and how you as a leader have to emotionally regulate yourself, which I think is another topic that we'll be getting into as well with future guests. How do leaders emotionally self-regulate, participate in self-care and promote self-care and mental health well-being in the workplace, because a lot of folks still need it now. We're not out of the pandemic completely yet.
Again, and it's like I'm always going to push back. We're not just talking about leaders here, and we're going to probably even have to have a show about Dan and I'll have to have a fisticuff show about leadership. Like at some point in time, defining what it is. I'm much more disruptive about it. I think in my definitions, probably almost lean more towards the Mr. Keys aspect to some degree at times. But my point being is, we want to care everybody. We need to think about the well-being of everybody in an organization, not just the leaders.
I would argue that everybody in an organization has the potential to be a leader.
Sure.
I mean, there's a different, we always have to differentiate. There's formal leadership where you have the position and power and authority with that role, or supposed power. It's often an illusion.
Yeah.
And then you have informal leadership, right? Which is somebody who might not be in a position of formal authority, but still has to take the lead at times because of their expertise or just with their positionality within the organization. And so anybody from the janitor to the executive suite, anybody within an organization can be a leader
or exhibit leadership approaches. And in that final thing, I think that this fifth aspect that you've highlighted is probably the one that resonates with me the most on some level. It's the modeling. The modeling of the world around us, looking at these things and helping us sort of figure out what this world looks like now, what it's going to look like in the future, and then how do we as humans, as living organisms, that
as mortals, to bring us back to the theme of death, right?
That care, that love, that have hopes, that have dreams, that poop, they eat, whatever, how does this world of automation and digital transformation, which is really hitting a stride now, which is really making a huge, I mean, it has been, but I think we're hitting a orders of magnitude change probably here very soon on this. How do we model this in our heads? What kind of decisions? Because I think we as a society are probably going to have to actually make decisions. If we don't, what's going to manifest might not be something that we're probably going to be very happy with. I could be wrong, and we can make that debate, but it is the modeling of this world and trying to make sense of that from these signals that I'm going to definitely be diving head on as we move forward over this next year.
Yeah, same here. And, we're working really hard. We're going to have a whole slew of new guests coming up in the next few months. And so we're planning those interviews. And so we just hope that you can subscribe, click a like for this video, follow us. And I know people, you can't always trust the YouTube as far as followers, because I know people are liking our website. We have a small website on a WordPress website.
Well, it'll be coming up soon. It'll be coming up soon, where you can go to sensensignal.com. Yep.
Yeah, there's two, but there are people who are liking the current one. That's kind of the one we're going to phase out eventually. But I mean, people are engaging with us within various different mediums, but we really want you to go to YouTube and subscribe there to keep up with the videos, because we're considering that our primary platform. We do release on on Spotify and Apple and a lot of other podcasting platforms as well. And we're experimenting with putting stuff up in different places. And, the shorts we're putting out on YouTube as well. And we are also going to post those on Instagram and TikTok and things like that.
And we'll be publishing as well. We'll be publishing actual written word. Dan has his history of writing stuff, and we'll be hosting that stuff. And as we move forward, we're still going to be figuring out and looking into how to improve our engagement with you. And really, this is a dialogue with you. And this might not be new. I'm sure other podcasts say this all the time, but your engagement is going to be critical. We really want to hear from you about the directions that we're taking and how they resonate with you. And if they resonate with you, how can we improve ourselves? You can tell us, you can make suggestions on perhaps guests that we should speak to or speak with. Or if you've got somebody that you think might be interesting for us to speak with, let us know. We're homespun enough that we can easily listen to all y'all. We're not famous yet. We'll ignore you, which will.
And speaking of that, Jodah, I put the carrot out there early in the episode if we set it up, you got to pay off. So we do take feedback, especially from Jodah's dad.
Yes. We do. And like I said, we will. I think we've agreed that it might be a segment at the end of our shows.
Yeah, responding to Doug. So I just want to address that. Doug has, of course, when you're starting a podcast, your initial base of listeners and participants, thank God, are your family and friends. Jodah's dad has been a loyal listener and given us some good feedback, right?
Absolutely.
About being more prepared and more direct and having more of a presence on the podcast when we're interviewing people. And I think those are things that we're incrementally trying to address to not overwhelm the guests, because we want the guests to shine. It's their show when a guest comes on with us, and we want to be there to serve the guest.
Well, it's an exploration. I mean, we're bringing guests on to hear from them, but also to talk, to have a conversation. So, yeah.
Yeah. So, so definitely give us feedback. Is there any other feedback you want to address from your dad, Jodah?
I think we'll just do it next episode at the 30s. We'll give him those 30 seconds and we'll just let him go. And maybe we'll even invite him on. Maybe he'll be like the Andy Rooney at the end of our show.
That would be nice.
Let me tell you about something.
And so Jodah's dad Jodah looks just like his dad. So just imagine Jodah with like just whiter hair.
Yeah, we're very similar. I think I was a genetic petri dish army experiment, probably is what I was. I think I could be wrong though. So, anyways, I think we're done. I hope this is good for everybody. Not to bore you to death. Just wanted to let you know who we are. While we didn't do this at the beginning, we probably should have. We were just so frenetic in trying to get things up and get things out there and stuff. And so maybe sometimes it's best to take
good unpacking.
But it's a time. It's unpacking thing. For sure, and maybe stitching time saves 9, as they say. So maybe this is a lesson, and maybe not speeding up always, but kind of slowing down and really putting some effort into something. So. So I hope this was informative for you all. And really, as Dan said, I really look forward to this as we move forward, this project. I'm looking to see where it goes. And I'm looking forward to working with you all as we move forward and try to make sense from the signals that are out there. And to navigate this world. And as Dan said, this, as much as we're talking about leadership in an abstract level. You might not think of yourself as a leader right now or ever, but what you are probably is a change agent. And that's really what we're talking about, is how effective are you as a change agent out there in the world that you're working in? You leading from below, leading from the side, leading from the bottom, whatever. So I feel this is a show for anybody who wants to make a difference actively.
Agreed. So thanks everybody for listening, and again, hit that subscribe and like button, and we'll see you soon with another episode.
Sayonara.
Take care, everyone.
Yep. Bye, everyone.
Bye.